Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 6. Eagle's Gift. The right and the left side awareness. Our discussion of dreaming was most helpful to us, not only because it solved our impasse in dreaming together, but because it brought its concepts to an intellectual level. Talking about it kept us busy. It allowed us to have a moment's pause in order to ease our agitation. One night while I was out running an errand, I called LaGorda from a telephone booth. She told me that she had been in a department store and had had the sensation that I was hiding there behind some mannequins on display. She was certain I was teasing her and became furious with me. She rushed through the store trying to catch me, to show me how angry she was. Then she realized that she was actually remembering something she had done quite often around me, having a tantrum. A display of bad temper in unison. We arrived then at the conclusion that it was time to try again our dreaming together. As we talked, we felt a renewed optimism. I went home immediately. I very easily entered into the first state, restful vigil. I had a sensation of bodily pleasure, a tingling radiating from my solar plexus, which was transformed into the thought that we were going to have great results. That thought turned into a nervous anticipation. I became aware that my thoughts were emanating from the tingling in the middle of my chest. The instant I turned my attention to it, however, the tingling stopped. It was like an electric current that I could switch on and off. The tingling began again, even more pronounced than before, and suddenly I found myself face to face with LaGorda. It was as if I had turned a corner and bumped into her. I became immersed in watching her. She was so absolutely real, so herself, that I had the urge to touch her. The most pure unearthly affection for her burst out of me at that moment. I began to sob uncontrollably. LaGorda quickly tried to interlock our arms to stop my indulging, but she could not move at all. We looked around. There was no fixed tableau in front of our eyes, no static picture of any sort. I had a sudden insight and told LaGorda that it was because we had been watching each other that we had missed the appearance of the dreaming scene. Only after I had spoken did I realize that we were in a new situation. The sound of my voice scared me. It was a strange voice, harsh, unappealing. It gave me a feeling of physical revulsion. LaGorda replied that we had not missed anything, that our second attention had been caught by something else. She smiled and made a puckering gesture with her mouth, a mixture of surprise and annoyance at the sound of her own voice. I found the novelty of talking and dreaming spellbinding, for we were not dreaming of a scene in which we talked, we were actually conversing. It required a unique effort quite similar to my initial effort of walking down a stairway and dreaming. I asked her whether she thought my voice sounded funny. She nodded and laughed out loud. The sound of her laughter was shocking. I remembered that Don Juan used to make the strangest and most frightening noises. LaGorda's laughter was in the same category. The realization struck me then that LaGorda and I had quite spontaneously entered into our dreaming bodies. I wanted to hold her hand. I tried, but I could not move my arm. Because I had some experience with moving in that state, I willed myself to go to LaGorda's side. My desire was to embrace her, but instead I moved in on her so close that we merged. I was aware of myself as an individual being, but at the same time I felt I was part of LaGorda. I liked that feeling immensely. We stayed merged until something broke our hold. I felt a command to examine the environment. As I looked, I clearly remembered having seen it before. We were surrounded by small round mounds that looked exactly like sand dunes. They were all around us in every direction as far as we could see. They seemed to be made of something that looked like pale yellow sandstone or rough granules of sulfur. The sky was the same color and was very low and oppressive. There were banks of yellowish fog or some sort of yellow vapor that hung from certain spots in the sky. I noticed then that Lagorda and I seemed to be breathing normally. I could not feel my chest with my hands, but I was able to feel it expanding as I inhaled. The yellow vapors were obviously not harmful to us. We began to move in unison, slowly, cautiously, almost as if we were walking. After a short distance I got very fatigued, and so did Lagorda. We were gliding just over the ground, and apparently moving that way was very tiring to our second attention. It required an inordinate degree of concentration. We were not deliberately mimicking our ordinary walk, but the effect was much the same as if we had been. To move required outbursts of energy, something like tiny explosions, with pauses in between. We had no objective in our movement except moving itself, so finally we had to stop. Lagorda spoke to me, her voice so faint that it was barely audible. She said that we were mindlessly going toward the heavier regions, and that if we kept on moving in that direction, the pressure would get so great that we would die. We automatically turned around and headed back in the direction we had come from, but the feeling of fatigue did not let up. Both of us were so exhausted that we could no longer maintain our upright posture. We collapsed and quite spontaneously adopted the dreaming position. I woke up instantly in my study. Lagorda woke up in her bedroom. The first thing I told her upon awakening was that I had been in that barren landscape several times before. I had seen at least two aspects of it, one perfectly flat, the other covered with small mounds like sand dunes. As I was talking, I realized that I had not even bothered to confirm that we had had the same vision. I stopped and told her that I had gotten carried away by my own excitement. I had proceeded as if I were comparing notes with her about a vacation trip. "It's too late for that kind of talk between us," she said with a sigh, "but if it makes you happy, I'll tell you what we saw." She patiently described everything we had seen, said, and done. She added that she too had been in that deserted place before, and that she knew for a fact that it was a no man's land, the space between the world we know and the other world. "It is the area between the parallel lines," she went on. "We can go to it in dreaming. But in order to leave this world and reach the other, the one beyond the parallel lines, we have to go through that area with our whole bodies." I felt a chill at the thought of entering that barren place with our whole bodies. "You and I have been there together with our bodies," Lagorda went on. "Don't you remember?" I told her that all I could remember was seeing that landscape twice under Don Juan's guidance. Both times I had written off the experience because it had been brought about by the ingestion of hallucinogenic plants. Following the dictums of my intellect, I had regarded them as private visions, and not as consensual existing with agreement by multiple individuals' experiences. I did not remember viewing that scene under any other circumstances. "When did you and I get there with our bodies?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. The vague memory of it just popped into my mind when you mentioned being there before. I think that now it is your turn to help me finish what I have started to remember. I can't focus on it yet, but I do recall that Silvio Manuel took the Nagual woman, you, and me into that desolate place. I don't know why he took us in there, though. We were not in dreaming. I did not hear what else she was saying. My mind had begun to zero in on something still inarticulate. Inarticulate without, or deprived of the use of speech or words, I struggled to set my thoughts in order. They rambled aimlessly. For a moment I felt as if I had reverted back years, to a time when I could not stop my internal dialogue. Then the fog began to clear. My thoughts arranged themselves without my conscious direction, and the result was the full memory of an event which I had already partially recalled in one of those unstructured flashes of recollection that I used to have. Lagorta was right. We had been taken once to a region that Don Juan had called limbo, apparently drawing the term from religious dogma. I knew that Lagorta was also right in saying that we had not been in dreaming. On that occasion, at the request of Silvio Manuel, Don Juan had rounded up the Nagual woman, Lagorta, and myself. Don Juan told me that the reason for our meeting was the fact that, by my own means, but without knowing how, I had entered into a special recess of awareness which was the site of the keenest form of attention. I had previously reached that state, which Don Juan had called the left side, but all too briefly and always aided by him. One of its main features, the one that had the greatest value for all of us involved with Don Juan, was that in that state, we were able to perceive a colossal bank of yellowish vapor, something which Don Juan called the wall of fog. Whenever I was capable of perceiving it, it was always to my right, extending forward to the horizon and up to infinity, thus dividing the world in two. The wall of fog would turn either to the right or to the left as I turned my head, so there was never a way for me to face it. On the day in question, both Don Juan and Silvio Manuel had talked to me about the wall of fog. I remembered that after Silvio Manuel had finished talking, he grabbed Lagorta by the nape of her neck, as if she were a kitten, and disappeared with her into the bank of fog. I had had a split second to observe their disappearance, because Don Juan had somehow succeeded in making me face the wall myself. He did not pick me up by the nape of the neck, but pushed me into the fog, and the next thing I knew, I was looking at the desolate plain. Don Juan, Silvio Manuel, the Nagual woman, and Lagorta were also there. I did not care what they were doing. I was concerned with a most unpleasant and threatening feeling of oppression, a fatigue, a maddening difficulty in breathing. I perceived that I was standing inside a suffocating, yellow, low-ceilinged cave. The physical sensation of pressure became so overwhelming that I could no longer breathe. It seemed that all my physical functions had stopped. I could not feel any part of my body, yet I still could move, walk, extend my arms, rotate my head. I put my hands on my thighs. There was no feeling in my thighs, nor in the palms of my hands. My legs and arms were visibly there, but not palpably as to be capable of being perceived by the senses or the mind. Being capable of being handled, or touched, or felt there. Moved by the boundless fear I was feeling, I grabbed the Nagual woman by the arm and yanked her off balance. But it was not my muscle strength that had pulled her. It was a force that was stored, not in my muscles or skeletal frame, but in the very center of my body. Wanting to play that force once more, I grabbed Lagorda. She was rocked by the strength of my pull. Then I realized that the energy to move them had come from a stick-like protuberance that acted upon them as a tentacle. It was balanced at the midpoint of my body. All that had taken only an instant. The next moment I was back again at the same point of physical anguish and fear. I looked at Silvio Manuel in a silent plea for help. The way he returned my look convinced me that I was lost. His eyes were cold and indifferent. Don Juan turned his back to me, and I shook from the inside out with a physical terror beyond comprehension. I thought that the blood in my body was boiling, not because I felt heat, but because an internal pressure was mounting to the point of bursting. Don Juan commanded me to relax and abandon myself to my death. He said that I had to remain in there until I died. He said that I had a chance to either die peacefully if I would make a supreme effort and let my terror possess me, or I could die in agony if I chose to fight it. Silvio Manuel spoke to me, a thing he rarely did. He said that the energy I needed to accept my terror was in my middle point, and that the only way to succeed was to acquiesce to agree or express agreement to surrender without surrendering. The Nagual woman and Lagorda were perfectly calm. I was the only one who was dying there. Silvio Manuel said that the way I was wasting energy, my end was only moments away, and that I should consider myself already dead. Don Juan signaled the Nagual woman and Lagorda to follow him. They turned their backs to me. I did not see what else they did. I felt a powerful vibration go through me. I figured that it was my death rattle. My struggle was over. I did not care anymore. I gave in to the unsurpassable terror that was killing me. My body, or the configuration I regarded as my body, relaxed, abandoned itself to its death. As I let the terror come in, or perhaps go out of me, I felt and saw a tenuous vapor, a whitish smear against the sulfur-yellow surroundings leaving my body. Don Juan came back to my side and examined me with curiosity. Silvio Manuel moved away and grabbed Lagorda again by the nape of her neck. I clearly saw him hurling her, like a giant rag doll, into the fog bank. Then he stepped in himself and disappeared. The Nagual woman made a gesture to invite me to come into the fog. I moved toward her, but before I reached her, Don Juan gave me a forceful shove that propelled me through the thick yellow fog. I did not stagger but glided through, and ended up falling headlong onto the ground in the everyday world. Lagorda remembered the whole affair as I narrated it to her. Then she added more details. The Nagual woman and I were not afraid for your life, she said. The Nagual had told us that you had to be forced to give up your holdings, but that was nothing new. Every male warrior has to be forced by fear. Silvio Manuel had already taken me behind that wall 3 times so that I would learn to relax. He said that if you saw me at ease, you would be affected by it, and you were. You gave up and relaxed. Did you also have a hard time learning to relax? I asked. No. It's a cinch for a woman, she said. That's our advantage. The only problem is that we have to be transported through the fog. We can't do it on our own. Why not, Gorda? I asked. One needs to be very heavy to go through and a woman is light, she said. Too light, in fact. What about the Nagual woman? I didn't see anyone transporting her, I said. The Nagual woman was special, Lagorda said. She could do everything by herself. She could take me in there, or take you. She could even pass through that deserted plain, a thing which the Nagwal said was mandatory for all travelers who journey into the unknown. Why did the Nagwal woman go in there with me? I asked. Silvio Manuel took us along to buttress make stronger or defensible with supports you, she said. He thought that you needed the protection of 2 females and 2 males flanking you. Silvio Manuel thought that you needed to be protected from the entities that roam and lurk in there. Allies come from that deserted plain. And other things even more fierce. Were you also protected? I asked. I don't need protection, she said. I'm a woman. I'm free from all that. But we all thought that you were in a terrible fix. You were the Nagwal, and a very stupid one. We thought that any of those fierce allies, or if you wish, call them demons, could have blasted you, or dismembered you. That was what Silvio Manuel said. He took us to flank your 4 corners. But the funny part was that neither the Nagwal nor Silvio Manuel knew that you didn't need us. We were supposed to walk for quite a while until you lost your energy. Then Silvio Manuel was going to frighten you by pointing out the allies to you and beckoning them to come after you. He and the Nagwal planned to help you little by little. That is the rule. But something went wrong. The minute you got in there, you went crazy. You hadn't moved an inch and you were already dying. You were frightened to death and you hadn't even seen the allies yet. Silvio Manuel told me that he didn't know what to do, so he said in your ear the last thing he was supposed to say to you, to give in, to surrender without surrendering. You became calm at once all by yourself, and they didn't have to do any of the things that they had planned. There was nothing for the Nagwal and Silvio Manuel to do except to take us out of there. I told Lagorda that when I found myself back in the world there was someone standing by me who helped me to stand up. That was all I could recollect. We were in Silvio Manuel's house, she said. I can now remember a lot about that house. Someone told me, I don't know who, that Silvio Manuel found that house and bought it because it was built on a power spot. But someone else said that Silvio Manuel found the house, liked it, bought it, and then brought the power spot to it. I personally feel that Silvio Manuel brought the power. I feel that his impeccability held the power spot on that house for as long as he and his companions lived there. When it was time for them to move away, the power of that spot vanished with them, and the house became what it had been before Silvio Manuel found it, an ordinary house. As Lagorda talked, my mind seemed to clear up further, but not enough to reveal what had happened to us in that house that filled me with such sadness. Without knowing why, I was sure it had to do with the Nagwal woman. Where was she? Lagorda did not answer when I asked her that. There was a long silence. She excused herself, saying that she had to make breakfast. It was already morning. She left me by myself with a most painful, heavy heart. I called her back. She got angry and threw her pots on the floor. I understood why. In another session of dreaming together we went still deeper into the intricacies of the second attention. This took place a few days later. Lagorda and I, with no such expectation or effort, found ourselves standing together. She tried 3 or 4 times in vain to interlock her arm with mine. She spoke to me, but her speech was incomprehensible. I knew, however, that she was saying that we were again in our dreaming bodies. She was cautioning me that all movement should stem from our midsections. As in our last attempt, No dreaming scene presented itself for our examination, but I seemed to recognize a physical locale which I had seen in dreaming nearly every day for over a year. It was the valley of the saber-toothed tiger. We walked a few yards. This time our movements were not jerky or explosive. We actually walked from the belly with no muscular action involved. The trying part was my lack of practice. It was like the first time I had ridden a bicycle. I easily got tired and lost my rhythm. I became hesitant and unsure of myself. We stopped. Lagorda was out of synchronization, too. We began then to examine what was around us. Everything had an indisputable reality, at least to the eye. We were in a rugged area with a weird vegetation. I could not identify the strange shrubs I saw. They seemed like small trees, 5 to 6 feet high. They had a few leaves, which were flat and thick, chartreuse in color, and huge, gorgeous, deep brown flowers striped with gold. The stems were not woody, but seemed to be light and pliable, like reeds. They were covered with long, formidable-looking needle-like thorns. Some old dead plants that had dried up and fallen to the ground gave me the impression that the stems were hollow. The ground was very dark and seemed moist. I tried to bend over to touch it, but I failed to move. Lagorda signaled me to use my midsection. When I did that, I did not have to bend over to touch the ground. There was something in me like a tentacle which could feel, but I could not tell what I was feeling. There were no particular tactile qualities on which to base distinctions. The ground that I touched appeared to be soil, not to my sense of touch, but to what seemed to be a visual core in me. I was plunged then into an intellectual dilemma. Why would dreaming seem to be the product of my visual faculty? Was it because of the predominance of the visual in daily life? The questions were meaningless. I was in no position to answer them, and all my queries did was to debilitate my second attention. Lagorda jolted me out of my deliberations by ramming me. I experienced a sensation like a blow. A tremor ran through me. She pointed ahead of us. As usual, the saber-toothed tiger was lying on the ledge where I had always seen it. We approached until we were a mere 6 feet from the ledge, and we had to lift our heads to see the tiger. We stopped. It stood up. Its size was stupendous, especially its breadth. I knew that Lagorda wanted us to sneak around the tiger to the other side of the hill. I wanted to tell her that that might be dangerous, but I could not find a way to convey the message to her. The tiger seemed angry, aroused. It crouched back on its hind legs, as if it were preparing to jump on us. I was terrified. Lagorda turned to me, smiling. I understood that she was telling me not to succumb to my panic, because the tiger was only a ghost-like image. With a movement of her head, she coaxed me to go on. Yet at an unfathomable level, I knew that the tiger was an entity, perhaps not in the factual sense of our daily world, but real nonetheless. And because Lagorda and I were dreaming, we had lost our own factuality in the world. At that moment we were on a par with the tiger. Our existence also was ghost-like. We took one more step at the nagging insistence of Lagorda. The tiger jumped from the ledge. I saw its enormous body hurtling through the air, coming directly at me. I lost the sense that I was dreaming. To me, the tiger was real and I was going to be ripped apart. A barrage of lights, images, and the most intense primary colors I had ever seen flashed all around me. I woke up in my study. After we became extremely proficient in our dreaming together, I had the certainty that we had managed to secure our detachment, and we were no longer in a hurry. The outcome of our efforts was not what moved us to act. It was rather an ulterior compulsion that gave us the impetus to act impeccably without thought of reward. Our subsequent sessions were like the first, except for the speed and ease with which we entered into the second state of dreaming, dynamic vigil. Our proficiency in dreaming together was such that we successfully repeated it every night. Without any such intention on our part, our dreaming together focused itself randomly on three areas: on the sand dunes, on the habitat of the saber-toothed tiger, and most important, on forgotten past events. When the scenes that confronted us had to do with forgotten events in which Lagorda and I had played an important role, she had no difficulty in interlocking her arm with mine. That act gave me an irrational sense of security. Lagorda explained that it fulfilled a need to dispel the utter aloneness that the second attention produces. She said that to interlock the arms promoted a mood of objectivity, and as a result, we could watch the activity that took place in every scene. At times we were compelled to be part of the activity. At other times we were thoroughly objective and watched the scene as if we were in a movie theater. When we visited the sand dunes or the habitat of the tiger, we were unable to interlock arms. In those instances our activity was never the same twice. Our actions were never premeditated, but seemed to be spontaneous reactions to novel situations. According to Lagorda, most of our dreaming together grouped itself into three categories. The first and by far the largest was a reenactment of events we had lived together. The second was a review that both of us did of events I alone had lived. The land of the saber-toothed tiger was in this category. The third was an actual visit to a realm that existed as we saw it at the moment of our visit. She contended that those yellow mounds are present here and now, and that is the way they look and stand always to the warrior who journeys into them. I wanted to argue a point with her. She and I had had mysterious interactions with people we had forgotten for reasons inconceivable to us, but whom we had nonetheless known in fact. The saber-toothed tiger, on the other hand, was a creature of my dreaming. I could not conceive both of them to be in the same category. Before I had time to voice my thoughts, I got her answer. It was as if she were actually inside my mind reading it like a text. "They are in the same class," she said, and laughed nervously. "We can't explain why we have forgotten, or how it is that we are remembering now. We can't explain anything. The saber-toothed tiger is there, somewhere. We'll never know where. But why should we worry about a made-up inconsistency? To say that one is a fact and the other a dream has no meaning whatever to the other self." Lagorda and I used dreaming together as a means of reaching an unimagined world of hidden memories. Dreaming together enabled us to recollect events that we were incapable of retrieving with our everyday life memory. When we rehashed those events in our waking hours, it triggered yet more detailed recollections. In this fashion we disinterred, dig up dead bodies for reburial or for medical investigation, so to speak, masses of memories that had been buried in us. It took us almost 2 years of prodigious so great in size, force, or extent as to elicit awe, effort and concentration to arrive at a modicum, a smaller moderate or token amount of understanding of what had happened to us. Don Juan had told us that human beings are divided in two. The right side, which he called the tonal, encompasses everything the intellect can conceive of, The left side, called the Nagual, is a realm of indescribable features, a realm impossible to contain in words. The left side is perhaps comprehended, if comprehension is what takes place, with the total body, thus its resistance to conceptualization. Conceptualization, inventing or contriving an idea or explanation and formulating it mentally. Don Juan had also told us that all the faculties, possibilities, and accomplishments of sorcery, from the simplest to the most astounding, are in the human body itself. Taking as a base the concepts that we are divided in two and that everything is in the body itself, Lagorta proposed an explanation of our memories. She believed that during the years of our association with the Nagual Juan Matus, our time was divided between states of normal awareness, on the right side, the tonal, where the first attention prevails, and states of heightened awareness, on the left side, the Nagual, or the side of the second attention. Lagorta thought that the Nagual Juan Matus's efforts were to lead us to the other self by means of our self-control of the second attention through dreaming. However, he put us in direct touch with the second attention through bodily manipulation. Lagorta remembered that he used to force her to go from one side to the other by pushing or massaging her back. She said that sometimes he would even give her a sound blow over or around her right shoulder blade. The result was her entrance into an extraordinary state of clarity. To Lagorta, it seemed that everything in that state went faster, yet nothing in the world had been changed. It was weeks after Lagorta told me this that I remembered the same had been the case with me. At any given time, Don Juan might give me a blow on my back. I always felt the blow on my spine, high between my shoulder blades. An extraordinary clarity would follow. The world was the same but sharper. Everything stood by itself. It may have been that my reasoning faculties were numbed by Don Juan's blow, thus allowing me to perceive without their intervention. I would stay clear indefinitely or until Don Juan would give me another blow on the same spot to make me revert back to a normal state of awareness. He never pushed or massaged me. It was always a direct sound blow, not like the blow of a fist, but rather a smack that took my breath away for an instant. I would have to gasp and take long, fast gulps of air until I could breathe normally again. Lagorta reported the same effect. All the air would be forced out of her lungs by the Nagual's blow, and she would have to breathe extra hard to fill them up again. Lagorta believed that breath was the all-important factor. In her opinion, the gulps of air that she had to take after being struck were what made the difference, yet she could not explain in what way breathing would affect her perception and awareness. She also said that she was never hit back into normal awareness. She reverted back to it by her own means, although without knowing how. Her remarks seemed relevant to me. As a child, and even as an adult, I had occasionally had the wind knocked out of me when I took a fall on my back. But the effect of Don Juan's blow, though it left me breathless, was not like that at all. There was no pain involved. Instead, it brought on a sensation impossible to describe. The closest I can come is to say that it created a feeling like dryness in me. The blows to my back seemed to dry out my lungs and fog up everything else. Then, as Lagorta had observed, everything that had become hazy after the Nagual's blow became crystal clear as I breathed, as if breath were the catalyst, something that causes an important event to happen, the all-important factor. The same thing would happen to me on the way back to the awareness of everyday life. The air would be knocked out of me, The world I was watching would become foggy, and then it would clear as I filled up my lungs. Another feature of those states of heightened awareness was the incomparable richness of personal interaction, a richness that our bodies understood as a sensation of speeding. Our back and forth movement between the right and the left sides made it easier for us to realize that on the right side, too much energy and time is consumed in the actions and interactions of our daily life. On the left side, on the other hand, there is an inherent need for economy and speed. Lagorda could not describe what this speed really was, and neither could I. The best I could do would be to say that on the left side, I could grasp the meaning of things with precision and directness. Every facet of activity was free of preliminaries or introductions. I acted and rested. I went forth and retreated without any of the thought processes that are usual to me. This was what Lagorda and I understood as speeding. Lagorda and I discerned at one moment that the richness of our perception on the left side was a post facto realization. Our interaction appeared to be rich in the light of our capacity to remember it. We became cognizant then that in these states of heightened awareness we had perceived everything in one clump, one bulky mass of inextricable detail. We called this ability to perceive everything at once intensity. For years we had found it impossible to examine the separate constituent parts of those chunks of experience. We had been unable to synthesize those parts into a sequence that would make sense to the intellect. Since we were incapable of those syntheses, we could not remember. Our incapacity to remember was in reality an incapacity to put the memory of our perception on a linear basis. We could not lay our experiences flat, so to speak, and arrange them in a sequential order. The experiences were available to us, but at the same time they were impossible to retrieve because they were blocked by a wall of intensity. The task of remembering, then, was properly the task of joining our left and right sides, of reconciling those two distinct forms of perception into a unified whole. It was the task of consolidating the totality of oneself by rearranging intensity into a linear sequence. It occurred to us that the activities we remembered taking part in might not have taken long to perform in terms of time measured by the clock. By reason of our capacity to perceive in terms of intensity, we may have had only a subliminal sensation of lengthy passages of time. Lagorda felt that if we could rearrange intensity into a linear sequence, we would honestly believe that we had lived 1,000 years. The pragmatic guided by practical experience and observation rather than theory step that Don Juan took to aid our task of remembering was to make us interact with certain people while we were in a state of heightened awareness. He was very careful not to let us see those people when we were in a state of normal awareness. In this way he created the appropriate conditions for remembering. Upon completing our remembering, Lagorda and I entered into a bizarre state. We had detailed knowledge of social interactions which we had shared with Don Juan and his companions. These were not memories in the sense that I would remember an episode from my childhood. They were more than vivid moment-to-moment recollections of events. We reconstructed conversations that seemed to be reverberating in our ears, as if we were listening to them. Both of us felt that it was superfluous, serving no useful purpose to try to speculate about what was happening to us. What we remembered, from the point of view of our experiential selves, was taking place now. Such was the character of our remembering. At last Lagorda and I were able to answer the questions that had driven us so hard. We remembered who the Nagual woman was, where she fit among us, what her role had been. We deduced, more than remembered, that we had spent equal amounts of time with Don Juan and Don Genero in normal states of awareness, and with Don Juan and his other companions in states of heightened awareness. We recaptured every nuance of those interactions which had been veiled by intensity. Upon a thoughtful review of what we had found, we realized that we had bridged the two sides of ourselves in a minimal fashion. We turned then to other topics, new questions that had come to take precedence over the old ones. There were three subjects, three questions, that summarized all of our concerns. Who was Don Juan and who were his companions? What had they really done to us? And where had all of them gone? Part 3. The Eagle's Gift. The Rule of the Nagual. Don Juan had been extremely sparing with information about his background and personal life. His reticence not volunteering anything more than necessary was, fundamentally, a didactic instructive device. As far as he was concerned, his time began when he became a warrior. Anything that had happened to him before was of very little consequence. All Lagorda and I knew about his early life was that he was born in Arizona of Yaqui and Yuma Indian parentage. When he was still an infant, his parents took him to live with the Yaquis in northern Mexico. At 10 years of age he was caught in the tide of the Yaqui Wars. His mother was killed then, and his father was apprehended by the Mexican army. Both Don Juan and his father were sent to a relocation center in the farthest southern state of Yucatan. He grew up there. Whatever happened to him during that period was never disclosed to us. Don Juan believed there was no need to tell us about it. I felt otherwise. The importance that I gave to that segment of his life arose from my erroneous conviction that the distinctive features and the emphasis of his leadership grew out of that personal inventory of experience. But that inventory, important as it might have been, was not what gave him the paramount significance he had in our eyes and in the eyes of his other companions. His total preeminence, high status, importance owing to marked superiority, rested on the fortuitous act of becoming involved with the rule. Being involved with the rule may be described as living a myth. Don Juan lived a myth that caught him and made him the Nagual. Don Juan said that when the rule caught him, he was an aggressive, unruly man, living in exile as thousands of other Yaqui Indians from northern Mexico lived at that time. He worked in the tobacco plantations of southern Mexico. One day after work, in a nearly fatal encounter with a fellow worker over matters of money, he was shot in the chest. When he regained consciousness, an old Indian was leaning over him, poking the small wound in his chest with his fingers. The bullet had not penetrated the chest cavity, but was lodged in the muscle against a rib. Don Juan fainted 2 or 3 times from shock, loss of blood, and in his own words, from fear of dying. The old Indian removed the bullet, and since Don Juan had no place to stay, the old Indian took Don Juan to his own house and nursed him for over a month. The old Indian was kind but severe. One day when Don Juan was fairly strong and almost recovered, the old man gave him a sound blow on his back and forced him into a state of heightened awareness. Then, without any further preliminaries, he revealed to Don Juan the portion of the rule which pertained to the Nagual in his role. Don Juan did exactly the same thing with me and with Lagorda. He made us shift levels of awareness and told us the rule of the Nagual in the following way. The power that governs the destiny of all living beings is called the eagle, not because it is an eagle or has anything to do with an eagle, but because it appears to the seer as an immeasurable jet black eagle, standing erect as an eagle stands, its height reaching to infinity. As the seer gazes on the blackness that the eagle is, 4 blazes of light reveal what the eagle is like. The first blaze, which is like a bolt of lightning, helps the seer make out the contours of the eagle's body. There are patches of whiteness that look like an eagle's feathers and talons. A second blaze of lightning reveals the flapping, wind-creating blackness that looks like an eagle's wings. With the third blaze of lightning, the seer beholds a piercing, inhuman eye. The fourth and last blaze discloses what the eagle is doing. The eagle is devouring the awareness of all the creatures that a moment before were alive on earth, are now dead, and have floated to the eagle's beak like a ceaseless swarm of fireflies to meet their owner, this being their reason for having had life. The eagle disentangles these tiny flames, lays them flat like a tanner stretches out a hide, and then consumes them, for awareness is the eagle's food. The eagle, the power that governs the destinies of all living things, reflects equally and at once all those living things. There is no way, therefore, for man to pray to the eagle, to ask favors, or to hope for grace. The human part of the eagle is too insignificant to move the whole. It is only from the eagle's actions that a seer can tell what it wants. The eagle, although it is not moved by the circumstances of any living thing, has granted a gift to each of those beings. In those beings' own way, and by right, any one of them, if it so desires, has the power to keep the flame of awareness, the power to disobey the summons to die and be consumed. Every living thing has been granted the power, if it so desires, to seek an opening to freedom and to go through it. It is evident to the seer who sees the opening, and to the creatures that go through it, that the eagle has granted that gift in order to perpetuate awareness. For the purpose of guiding living things to that opening, the eagle created the Nagwal. The Nagwal is a double being to whom the rule has been revealed. Whether the Nagwal be in the form of a human being, an animal, a plant, or anything else that lives, the Nagwal by virtue of its doubleness is drawn to seek that hidden passageway. In human beings, the Nagwal comes in pairs, male and female. A double man and a double woman become the Nagwal only after the rule has been told to each of them, and each of them has understood it and accepted it in full. To the eye of the seer, a Nagwal man or Nagwal woman appears as a luminous egg with 4 compartments. Unlike the average human being who has 2 sides, only a left and a right, the Nagwal has a left side divided into 2 long sections, and a right side equally divided in 2. The eagle created the first Nagwal man and Nagwal woman as seers, and immediately put them in the world to see. The eagle provided them with 4 female warriors who were stalkers, 3 male warriors, and 1 male courier whom the Nagwal pair were to nourish, enhance, and lead to freedom. The female warriors are called the 4 directions, the 4 corners of a square, the 4 moods, the 4 winds, and are the 4 different female personalities that exist in the human race. The first is the East. She is called Order. She is optimistic, light-hearted, smooth, and persistent, like a steady breeze. The second is the North. She is called Strength. She is resourceful, blunt, direct, and tenacious, like a hard wind. The third is the West. She is called Feeling. She is introspective, remorseful, cunning, and sly, like a cold gust of wind. The fourth is the South. She is called growth. She is nurturing, loud, shy, and warm, like a hot wind. The three male warriors in the courier are representative of the four types of male activity and temperament. The first type is the knowledgeable man, the scholar, a noble, dependable, and serene man fully dedicated to accomplishing his task, whatever it may be. The second type is the man of action, highly volatile, and a great humorous fickle companion. The third type is the organizer behind the scenes, the mysterious, unknowable man. Nothing can be said about him because he allows nothing about himself to slip out. The courier is the fourth type. He is the assistant, a taciturn, habitually reserved and uncommunicative somber man who does very well if properly directed, but who cannot stand on his own. In order to make things easier, the eagle showed the Nagwal man and Nagwal woman that each of these types among men and women of the earth has specific features in their luminous bodies. The scholar has a sort of shallow dent, a bright depression at his solar plexus. In some men it appears as a pool of intense luminosity, sometimes smooth and shiny like a mirror without a reflection. The man of action has some fibers emanating from the area of the will. The number of fibers varies from 1 to 5, and their size ranges from a mere string to a thick whip-like tentacle up to 8 feet long. Some men of action have as many as 3 of these fibers developed into tentacles. The man behind the scenes is recognized not by a feature, but by his ability to create, quite involuntarily, a burst of power that effectively blocks the attention of seers. When in the presence of this type of man, seers find themselves immersed in extraneous detail rather than seeing. The assistant has no obvious configuration. To seers he appears as a clear glow in a flawless shell of luminosity. In the female realm, the East is recognized by the almost imperceptible blotches in her luminosity, something like small areas of discoloration. The North has an overall radiation. She exudes a reddish glow, almost like heat. The West has a tenuous film enveloping her, a film which makes her appear darker than the others. The South has an intermittent glow. She shines for a moment and then gets dull, only to shine again. The Nagwal man and the Nagwal woman have 2 different movements in their luminous bodies. Their right sides wave, while their left sides whirl. In terms of personality, the Nagwal man is supportive, steady, unchangeable. The Nagwal woman is a being at war and yet relaxed, ever aware but without strain. Both of them reflect the 4 types of their sex, as 4 ways of behaving. The first command that the eagle gave the Nagwal man and Nagwal woman was to find, on their own, another set of 4 female warriors, 4 directions, who were the exact replicas of the stalkers, but who were dreamers. Dreamers appear to a seer as having an apron of hair-like fibers at their midsections. Stalkers have a similar apron-like feature, but instead of fibers the apron consists of countless small, round protuberances. The 8 female warriors are divided into 2 bands, which are called the right and left planets. The right planet is made up of 4 stalkers, the left of 4 dreamers. The warriors of each planet were taught by the eagle the rule of their specific task. Stalkers were taught stalking, dreamers were taught dreaming. The 2 female warriors of each direction live together. They are so alike that they mirror each other, and only through impeccability can they find solace and challenge in each other's reflection. The only time when the 4 dreamers or 4 stalkers get together is when they have to accomplish a strenuous task. But only under special circumstances should the four of them join hands, because their touch fuses them into one being. This should be done only in cases of dire need, or at the moment of leaving this world. The two female warriors of each direction are attached to one of the males, in any combination that is necessary. Thus they make a set of 4 households which are capable of incorporating as many warriors as needed. The male warriors and the courier can also form an independent unit of 4 men, or each can function as a solitary being as dictated by necessity. Next, Anagwal and his party were commanded to find 3 more couriers. These could be all males or all females or a mixed set. But the male couriers had to be of the 4th type of man, the assistant, and the females had to be from the south. In order to make sure that the first Nagwal man would lead his party to freedom and not deviate from that path or become corrupted, the eagle took the Nagwal woman to the other world to serve as a beacon, guiding the party to the opening. The Nagwal and his warriors were then commanded to forget. They were plunged into darkness and were given new tasks, the task of remembering themselves, and the task of remembering the eagle. The command to forget was so great that everyone was separated. They did not remember who they were. The eagle intended that if they were capable of remembering themselves again, they would find the totality of themselves. Only then would they have the strength and forbearance necessary to seek and face their definitive journey. Their last task, after they had regained the totality of themselves, was to get a new pair of double beings and transform them into a new Nagwal man and a new Nagwal woman by virtue of revealing the rule to them. And just as the first Nagwal man and Nagwal woman had been provided with a minimal party, they had to supply the new pair of Nagwals with 4 female warriors who were stalkers, 3 male warriors, and 1 male courier. When the first Nagwal and his party were ready to go through the passageway, the first Nagwal woman was waiting to guide them. They were ordered then to take the new Nagwal woman with them to the other world to serve as a beacon for her people, leaving the new Nagwal man in the world to repeat the cycle. While in the world, the minimal number under a Nagwal's leadership is 16. 8 female warriors, 3 male warriors, 4 couriers, and the Nagwal himself. At the moment of leaving the world when the new Nagwal woman is with them, the Nagwal's number is 17. If his personal power permits him to have more warriors, then more must be added in multiples of 4. I had confronted Don Juan with the question of how the rule became known to man. He explained that the rule was endless and covered every facet of a warrior's behavior. The interpretation and the accumulation of the rule is the work of seers whose only task throughout the ages has been to see the eagle, to observe its ceaseless flux. From their observations, the seers have concluded that, providing the luminous shell that comprises one's humanness has been broken, it is possible to find in the eagle the faint reflection of man. The eagle's irrevocable dictums can then be apprehended by seers, properly interpreted by them, and accumulated in the form of a governing body. Don Juan explained that the rule was not a tale, and that to cross over to freedom did not mean eternal life, as eternity is commonly understood, that is, as living forever. What the rule stated was that one could keep the awareness which is ordinarily relinquished at the moment of dying. Don Juan could not explain what it meant to keep that awareness, or perhaps he could not even conceive of it. His benefactor had told him that at the moment of crossing, one enters into the third attention, and the body in its entirety is kindled with knowledge. Every cell at once becomes aware of itself, and also aware of the totality of the body. His benefactor had also told him that this kind of awareness is meaningless to our compartmentalized minds. Therefore, the crux of the warrior's struggle was not so much to realize that the crossing over stated in the rule meant crossing to the third attention, but rather to conceive that there exists such an awareness at all. Don Juan said that in the beginning the rule was to him something strictly in the realm of words. He could not imagine how it could lapse into the domain of the actual world and its ways. Under the effective guidance of his benefactor, however, and after a great deal of work, he finally succeeded in grasping the true nature of the rule and totally accepted it as a set of pragmatic directives rather than a myth. From then on, he had no problem in dealing with the reality of the third attention. The only obstacle in his way arose from his being so thoroughly convinced that the rule was a map that he believed he had to look for a literal opening in the world, a passageway. Somehow he had become needlessly stuck at the first level of a warrior's development. Don Juan's own work as a leader and teacher, as a result, was directed at helping the apprentices, and especially me, to avoid repeating his mistake. What he succeeded in doing with us was to lead us through the 3 stages of a warrior's development without overemphasizing any of them. First, he guided us to take the rule as a map. Then he guided us to the understanding that one can attain a paramount awareness, because there is such a thing. And finally he guided us to an actual passageway into that other concealed world of awareness. In order to lead us through the first stage, the acceptance of the rule as a map, Don Juan took the section which pertains to the Nagual and his role, and showed us that it corresponds to unequivocal facts. He accomplished this by allowing us to have, while we were in stages of heightened awareness, an unrestricted interaction with the members of his group, who were the living personifications of the 8 types of people described by the rule. As we interacted with them, more complex and inclusive aspects of the rule were revealed to us, until we were capable of realizing that we were caught in the network of something which at first we had conceptualized as a myth, but which in essence was a map. Don Juan told us that in this respect his case had been identical to ours. His benefactor helped him go through that first stage by allowing him the same type of interaction. To that effect, he made him shift back and forth from the right side to the left side awareness, just as Don Juan had done to us. On the left side, he introduced him to the members of his own group, the 8 female and 3 male warriors, and the 4 couriers, who were, as is mandatory, the strictest examples of the types described by the rule. The impact of knowing them and dealing with them was staggering to Don Juan. Not only did it force him to regard the rule as a factual guide, but it made him realize the magnitude of our unknown possibilities. He said that by the time all the members of his own group had been gathered, he was so deeply committed to the warrior's way that he took for granted the fact that, without any overt effort on anybody's part, they had turned out to be perfect replicas of the warriors of his benefactor's party. The similarity of their personal likes, dislikes, affiliations, and so forth was not a result of imitation. Don Juan said that they belonged, as the rule had stated, to specific blocks of people who had the same input and output. The only differences among members of the same block were in the pitch of their voices and the sound of their laughter. In trying to explain to me the effects that the interaction with his benefactor's warriors had had on him, Don Juan touched on the subject of the very meaningful difference between his benefactor and himself in how they interpreted the rule, and also in how they led and taught other warriors to accept it as a map. He said that there are two types of interpretations: universal and individual. Universal interpretations take the statements that make up the body of the rule at face value. An example would be to say that the eagle does not care about man's actions, and yet it has provided man with a passageway to freedom. An individual interpretation, on the other hand, is a current conclusion arrived at by seers using universal interpretations as premises. An example would be to say that because of the eagle's lack of concern, I would have to make sure that my chances to reach freedom are enhanced, perhaps by my own dedication. According to Don Juan, he and his benefactor were quite different in the methods they used to lead their wards. Don Juan said that his benefactor's mode was severity. He led with an iron hand, and following his conviction that with the eagle free handouts are out of the question, he never did anything for anyone in a direct way. Instead, he actively helped everyone to help themselves. He considered that the eagle's gift of freedom is not a bestowal, but a chance to have a chance. Don Juan, although he appreciated the merits of his benefactor's method, disagreed with it. Later on, when he was on his own, he himself saw that it wasted precious time. For him, it was more expedient to present everyone with a given situation and force them to accept it, rather than wait until they were ready to face it on their own. That was his method with me and the other apprentices. The instance in which that difference in leadership had the greatest bearing for Don Juan was during the mandatory interaction that he had with his benefactor's warriors. The command of the rule was that his benefactor had to find for Don Juan first an Aguil woman, and then a group of 4 women and 4 men, to make up his warrior's party. His benefactor saw that Don Juan did not yet have enough personal power to assume the responsibility of an Aguil woman, and so he reversed the sequence and asked the females of his own group to find Don Juan the 4 women first, and then the 4 men. Don Juan confessed that he was enthralled with the idea of such a reversal. He had understood that those women were for his use, and in his mind that meant sexual use. His downfall, however, was to reveal his expectations to his benefactor, who immediately put Don Juan in contact with the men and women of his own party and left him alone to interact with them. For Don Juan, to meet those warriors was a true ordeal, not only because they were deliberately difficult with him, but because the nature of that encounter is meant to be a breakthrough. Don Juan said that interaction in the left side awareness cannot take place unless all the participants share that state. This was why he would not let us enter into the left side awareness, except to carry on our interaction with his warriors. That was the procedure his benefactor had followed with him. Don Juan gave me a brief account of what had taken place during his first meeting with the members of his benefactor's group. His idea was that I could use his experience perhaps as a sample of what to expect. He said that his benefactor's world had a magnificent regularity. The members of his party were Indian warriors from all over Mexico. At the time he met them, they lived in a remote mountainous area in southern Mexico. Upon reaching their house, Don Juan was confronted with 2 identical women, the biggest Indian women he had ever seen. They were sulky and mean, but had very pleasing features. When he tried to go between them, they caught him between their enormous bellies, grabbed his arms, and started beating him up. They threw him to the ground and sat on him, nearly crushing his ribcage. They kept him immobilized for over 12 hours while they conducted on-the-spot negotiations with his benefactor, who had to talk non-stop throughout the night until they finally let Don Juan get up around mid-morning. He said that what scared him the most was the determination that showed in the eyes of those women. He thought he was done for, that they were going to sit on him until he died, as they had said they would. Normally there should have been a waiting period of a few weeks before meeting the next set of warriors, but due to the fact that his benefactor was planning to leave him in their midst, Don Juan was immediately taken to meet the others. He met everyone in one day, and all of them treated him like dirt. They argued that he was not the man for the job, that he was too coarse and way too stupid, young but already senile in his ways. His benefactor argued brilliantly in his defense. He told them that they could change those conditions, and that it should be an ultimate delight for them and for Don Juan to take up that challenge. Don Juan said that his first impression was right. For him there was only work and hardship from then on. The women saw that Don Juan was unruly and could not be trusted to fulfill the complex and delicate task of leading 4 women. Since they were seers themselves, they made their own individual interpretation of the rule and decided that it would be more helpful for Don Juan to have the 4 male warriors first and then the 4 females. Don Juan said that their seeing had been correct because in order to deal with women warriors, an Agwal has to be in a state of consummate personal power, a state of serenity and control, in which human feelings play a minimal part, a state which at the time was inconceivable for him. His benefactor put him under the direct supervision of his 2 westerly women, the most fierce and uncompromising warriors of them all. Don Juan said that all westerly women, in accordance with the rule, are raving mad and have to be cared for. Under the duress of dreaming and stalking, they lose their right sides, their minds. Their reason burns up easily due to the fact that their left side awareness is extraordinarily keen. Once they lose their rational side, they are peerless dreamers and stalkers, since they no longer have any rational ballast to hold them back. Don Juan said that those women cured him of his lust. For 6 months he spent most of his time in a harness suspended from the ceiling of their rural kitchen, like a ham that was being smoked, until he was thoroughly purified from thoughts of gain and personal gratification. Don Juan explained that a leather harness is a superb device for curing certain maladies that are not physical. The idea is that the higher a person is suspended, and the longer that person is kept from touching the ground by dangling in mid-air, the better the possibilities of a true cleansing effect. While he was being cleansed by the westerly warriors, the other women were involved in the process of finding the men and the women for his party. It took years to accomplish this. Don Juan, in the meantime, was forced to interact with all his benefactor's warriors by himself. The presence of those warriors and his contact with them was so overwhelming to Don Juan that he believed he would never get out from under them. The result was his total and literal adherence to the body of the rule. Don Juan said that he spent irreplaceable time pondering the existence of an actual passageway into the other world. He viewed such a concern as a pitfall to be avoided at all costs. To protect me from it, he allowed the required interaction with the members of his group to be carried on while I was protected by the presence of Lagorda or any of the other apprentices. In my case, meeting Don Juan's warriors was the end result of a long process. There was never any mention of them in casual conversations with Don Juan. I knew of their existence solely by inference from the rule which he was revealing to me in installments. Later on, he admitted that they existed, and that eventually I would have to meet them. He prepared me for the encounter by giving me general instructions and pointers. He warned me about a common error, that of overestimating the left side awareness, of becoming dazzled by its clarity and power. He said that to be in the left side awareness does not mean that one is immediately liberated from one's folly. It only means an extended capacity for perceiving, a greater facility to understand and learn, and above all, a greater ability to forget. As the time approached for me to meet Don Juan's own warriors, he again gave me a scanty description of his benefactor's party as a guideline for my own use. He said that to an onlooker, his benefactor's world may have appeared at certain times as consisting of 4 households. The first was formed by the southerly women and the Nagual's courier, the second by the easterly women, the scholar, and a male courier, the third by the northerly women, the man of action, and another male courier, and the fourth by the westerly women, the man behind the scenes, and a third male courier. At other times that world may have seemed to be composed of groups. There was a group of 4 thoroughly dissimilar older men, who were Don Juan's benefactor and his 3 male warriors. Then a group of 4 men who were very similar to one another, who were the couriers. A group composed of 2 sets of apparently identical female twins who lived together and were the southerly and easterly women. And 2 other sets of apparently sisters, who were the northerly and westerly women. None of these women were relatives, they just looked alike, because of the enormous amount of personal power that Don Juan's benefactor had. Don Juan described the southerly women as being 2 mastodons, scary in appearance, but very friendly and warm. The easterly women were very beautiful, fresh and funny, a true delight to the eyes and the ears. The northerly women were utterly womanly, vain, coquettish like a seductive woman who uses her sex appeal to exploit men concerned with their aging, but also terribly direct and impatient. The westerly women were mad at times, and at other times they were the epitome of severity and purpose. They were the ones who disturbed Don Juan the most, because he could not reconcile the fact that they were so sober, kind, and helpful, with the fact that at any given moment, they could lose their composure and be raving mad. The men, on the other hand, were in no way memorable to Don Juan. He thought that there was nothing remarkable about them. They seemed to have been thoroughly absorbed by the shocking force of the women's determination, and by his benefactor's overpowering personality. Insofar as his own awakening was concerned, Don Juan said that upon being thrust into his benefactor's world, he realized how easy and convenient it had been for him to go through life with no self-restraint. He understood that his mistake had been to believe that his goals were the only worthwhile ones a man could have. All his life he had been a pauper. His consuming ambition, therefore, was to have material possessions, to be somebody. He had been so preoccupied with his desire to get ahead and his despair at not being successful that he had had no time for examining anything. He had gladly sided with his benefactor because he realized that he was being offered an opportunity to make something of himself. If nothing else, he thought he might learn to be a sorcerer. He conceived that immersion in his benefactor's world might have an effect on him, analogous to the effect of the Spanish conquest on the Indian culture. It destroyed everything, but it also forced a shattering self-examination. My response to the preparations to meet Don Juan's party of warriors was not, strangely enough, awe or fear, but a petty intellectual concern about two topics. The first was the proposition that there are only 4 types of men and 4 types of women in the world. I argued with Don Juan that the range of individual variation in people is too great for such a simple scheme. He disagreed with me. He said that the rule was final, and that it did not allow for an indefinite number of types of people. The second topic was the cultural context of Don Juan's knowledge. He did not know that himself. He viewed it as the product of a sort of pan-Indianism. His conjecture about its origin was that at one time, in the Indian world prior to the conquest, the handling of the second attention became vitiated. Vitiated, ruined in character or quality, it was developed without any hindrance over perhaps thousands of years, to the point that it lost its strength. The practitioners of that time may have had no need for controls, and thus without restraint, the second attention, instead of becoming stronger, became weaker by virtue of its increased intricacy. Then the Spanish invaders came and, with their superior technology, destroyed the Indian world. Don Juan said that his benefactor was convinced that only a handful of those warriors survived and were capable of reassembling their knowledge and redirecting their path. Whatever Don Juan and his benefactor knew about the second attention was the restructured version, a new version which had built-in restraints because it had been forged under the harshest conditions of suppression. The Nagual's party of warriors. When Don Juan judged that the time was right for me to have my first encounter with his warriors, he made me shift levels of awareness. He then made it perfectly clear that he would have nothing to do with their way of meeting me. He warned me that if they decided to beat me, he could not stop them. They could do anything they wanted, except kill me. He stressed over and over again that the warriors of his party were a perfect replica of his benefactors, except that some of the women were more fierce, and all the men were utterly unique and powerful. Therefore, my first encounter with them might resemble a head-on collision. I was nervous and apprehensive on the one hand, but curious on the other. My mind was running wild with endless speculations, most of them about what the warriors would look like. Don Juan said that he had the choice either of coaching me to memorize an elaborate ritual, as he had been made to do, or of making it the most casual encounter possible. He waited for an omen to point out which alternative to take. His benefactor had done something similar, only he had insisted Don Juan learn the ritual before the omen presented itself. When Don Juan revealed his sexual daydreams of sleeping with 4 women, his benefactor interpreted it as the omen, chucked the ritual, and ended up pleading like a hog dealer for Don Juan's life. In my case, Don Juan wanted an omen before he taught me the ritual. That omen came when Don Juan and I were driving through a border town in Arizona, and a policeman stopped me. The policeman thought I was an illegal alien. Only after I had shown him my passport, which he suspected of being a forgery, and other documents, did he let me go. Don Juan had been in the front seat next to me all the time, and the policeman had not given him a second glance. He had focused solely on me. Don Juan thought the incident was the omen he was waiting for. His interpretation of it was that it would be very dangerous for me to call attention to myself, and he concluded that my world had to be one of utter simplicity and candor. Elaborate ritual and pomp were out of character for me. He conceded, however, That the minimal observance of ritualistic patterns was in order when I made my acquaintance with his warriors. I had to begin by approaching them from the south, because that is the direction that power follows in its ceaseless flux. Life force flows to us from the south and leaves us flowing toward the north. He said that the only opening to an Agwal's world was through the south, and that the gate was made by two female warriors who would have to greet me and who would let me go through if they so decided. He took me to a town in central Mexico to a house in the countryside. As we approached it on foot from a southerly direction, I saw two massive Indian women standing 4 feet apart, facing each other. They were about 30 or 40 feet away from the main door of the house in an area where the dirt was hard packed. The two women were extraordinarily muscular and stern. Both had long, jet black hair held together in a single thick braid. They looked like sisters. They were about the same height and weight. I figured that they must have been around 5 feet 4 and weighed 150 pounds. One of them was extremely dark, almost black, the other much lighter. They were dressed like typical Indian women from central Mexico with long, full dresses and shawls, and homemade sandals. Don Juan made me stop 3 feet from them. He turned to the woman on our left and made me face her. He said that her name was Cecilia and that she was a dreamer. He then turned abruptly without giving me time to say anything and made me face the darker woman to our right. He said that her name was Delia and that she was a stalker. The women nodded at me. They did not smile or move to shake hands with me or make any gesture of welcome. Don Juan walked between them as if they were two columns marking a gate. He took a couple of steps and turned as if waiting for the women to invite me to go through. The women stared at me calmly for a moment. Then Cecilia asked me to come in as if I were at the threshold of an actual door. Don Juan led the way to the house. At the front door we found a man. He was very slender. At first sight he looked extremely young, but on closer examination, he appeared to be in his late 50s. He gave me the impression of being an old child. Small, wiry, with penetrating dark eyes. He was like an elfish apparition, a shadow. Don Juan introduced him to me as Emilito and said that he was his courier and all-around helper who would welcome me on his behalf. It seemed to me that Emilito was indeed the most appropriate being to welcome anyone. His smile was radiant. His small teeth were perfectly even. He shook hands with me, or rather he crossed his forearms and clasped both my hands. He seemed to be exuding enjoyment. Anyone would have sworn that he was ecstatic in meeting me. His voice was very soft and his eyes sparkled. We walked into a large room. There was another woman there. Don Juan said that her name was Teresa and that she was Cecilia's and Delia's courier. She was perhaps in her early 30s, and she definitely looked like Cecilia's daughter. She was very quiet but very friendly. We followed Don Juan to the back of the house where there was a roofed porch. It was a warm day. We sat there around a table, and after a frugal dinner we talked until after midnight. Emilito was the host. He charmed and delighted everyone with his exotic stories. The women opened up. They were a great audience for him. To hear the women's laughter was an exquisite pleasure. They were tremendously muscular, bold, and physical. At one point, when Emilito said that Cecilia and Delia were like two mothers to him, and Teresa like a daughter, they picked him up and tossed him in the air like a child. Of the two women, Delia seemed the more rational, down-to-earth. Cecilia was perhaps more aloof, but appeared to have greater inner strength. She gave me the impression of being more intolerant or more impatient. She seemed to get annoyed with some of Emilito's stories. Nonetheless, she was definitely on the edge of her chair when he would tell what he called his tales of eternity. He would preface every story with the phrase, "Do you, dear friends, know that?" The story that impressed me most was about some creatures that he said existed in the universe, who were the closest thing to human beings without being human, creatures who were obsessed against movement and were capable of detecting the slightest fluctuation inside themselves or around them. These creatures were so sensitive to motion that it was a curse to them. It gave them such pain that their ultimate ambition was to find quietude. Emilito would intersperse his tales of eternity with the most outrageous dirty jokes. Because of his incredible gifts as a raconteur, I understood every one of his stories as a metaphor or a parable with which he was teaching us something. Don Juan said that Emilito was merely reporting about things he had witnessed in his journeys through eternity. The role of a courier was to travel ahead of the Nagual, like a scout in a military operation. Emilito went to the limits of the second attention, and whatever he witnessed he passed on to the others. My second encounter with Don Juan's warriors was just as contrived as the first. One day Don Juan made me shift levels of awareness and told me that I had a second appointment. He made me drive to Zacatecas in northern Mexico. We arrived there very early in the morning. Don Juan said that that was only a stopover and that we had until the next day to relax before we embarked on my second formal meeting to make the acquaintance of the Eastern women and the scholar warrior of his party. He explained then an intricate and delicate point of choice. He said that we had met the South and the courier in the mid-afternoon because he had made an individual interpretation of the rule and had picked that hour to represent the night. The South was really the night, a warm, friendly, cozy night, and properly we should have gone to meet the two southerly women after midnight. However, that would have been inauspicious for me because my general direction was toward the light, toward optimism, an optimism that works itself harmoniously into the mystery of darkness. He said that that was precisely what we had done that day. We had enjoyed each other's company and talked until it was pitch black. I had wondered why they did not light their lanterns. Don Juan said that the East, on the other hand, was the morning, the light, and that we would meet the easterly women the next day at mid-morning. Before breakfast we went to the plaza and sat down on a bench. Don Juan told me that he wanted me to remain there and wait for him while he ran some errands. He left, and shortly after he had gone, a woman came and sat down on the other end of the bench. I did not pay any attention to her and started reading a newspaper. A moment later another woman joined her. I wanted to move to another bench, but I remembered that Don Juan had specifically said that I should sit there. I had turned my back to the women and had even forgotten that they were there since they were so quiet when a man greeted them and stood facing me. I became aware from their conversation that the women had been waiting for him. The man apologized for being late. He obviously wanted to sit down. I slid over to make room for him. He thanked me profusely and apologized for inconveniencing me. He said that they were absolutely lost in the city because they were rural people, and that once they had been to Mexico City and had nearly died in the traffic. He asked me if I lived in Zacatecas. I said no, and I was going to end our conversation right there, but there was something very winning about his smile. He was an old man, but was remarkably fit for his age. He was not an Indian. He seemed to be a gentleman farmer from a small rural town. He was wearing a suit and had a straw hat on. His features were very delicate. His skin was almost transparent. He had a high-bridged nose, a small mouth, and a perfectly groomed white beard. He looked extraordinarily healthy, and yet he seemed frail. He was of medium height and well-built, but at the same time gave the impression of being slender, almost a feat. A feat marked by excessive self-indulgence and moral decay. He stood up and introduced himself to me. He told me that his name was Vicente Medrano, and that he had come to the city on business only for the day. He then pointed to the two women and said that they were his sisters. The women stood up and faced us. They were very slim and darker than their brother. They were also much younger. One of them could have been his daughter. I noticed that their skin was not like his, theirs was dry. The two women were very good looking. Like the man, they had fine features, and their eyes were clear and peaceful. They were about 5'4". They were wearing beautifully tailored dresses, but with their shawls, low-heeled shoes, and dark cotton stockings, they looked like well-to-do farm women. The older one appeared to be in her 50s, the younger in her 40s. The man introduced them to me. The older woman was named Carmela and the younger one Hermelinda. I stood up and briefly shook hands with them. I asked them if they had any children. That question was usually a sure conversation opener for me. The women laughed and in unison ran their hands down their stomachs to show me how lean they were. The man calmly explained that his sisters were spinsters and that he himself was an old bachelor. He confided to me, in a half-joking tone, that unfortunately his sisters were too mannish. They lacked the femininity that makes a woman desirable, and so they had been unable to find husbands. I said that they were better off, considering the subservient role of women in our society. The women disagreed with me. They said that they would not have minded at all being servants if they had only found men who wanted to be their masters. The younger one said that the real problem was that their father had failed to teach them to behave like women. The man commented with a sigh that their father was so domineering that he had also prevented him from marrying by deliberately neglecting to teach him how to be a macho. All three of them sighed and looked gloomy. I wanted to laugh. After a long silence we sat down again, and the man said that if I stayed a while longer on that bench, I would have a chance to meet their father, who was still very spirited for his advanced age. He added in a shy tone that their father was going to take them to eat breakfast because they themselves never carried any money. Their father handled the purse strings. I was aghast. Those old people who looked so strong were in reality like weak, dependent children. I said goodbye to them and got up to leave. The man and his sisters insisted that I stay. They assured me that their father would love it if I would join them for breakfast. I did not want to meet their father, and yet I was curious. I told them that I myself was waiting for someone. At that, the women began to chuckle and then broke into a roaring laughter. The man also abandoned himself to uncontained laughter. I felt stupid. I wanted to get out of there. At that moment Don Juan showed up and I became aware of their maneuver. I did not think it was amusing. All of us stood up. They were still laughing as Don Juan told me that those women were the East, that Carmela was the stalker and Hermelinda the dreamer, and that Vicente was the warrior scholar and his oldest companion. As we were leaving the plaza, another man joined us, a tall, dark Indian, perhaps in his 40s. He was wearing Levi's and a cowboy hat. He seemed terribly strong and sullen. Don Juan introduced him to me as Juan Tuma, Vicente's courier and research assistant. We walked to a restaurant a few blocks away. The women held me between them. Carmela said that she hoped I was not offended by their joke, that they had had the choice of just introducing themselves to me or kidding me. What made them decide to kid me was my thoroughly snobbish attitude and turning my back to them and wanting to move to another bench. Hermelinda added that one has to be utterly humble and carry nothing to defend, not even one's person, that one's person should be protected, but not defended. In snubbing them, I was not protecting but merely defending myself. I felt quarrelsome. I was frankly put out by their masquerade. I began to argue, but before I had made my point, Don Juan came to my side. He told the two women that they should overlook my belligerence, that it takes a very long time to clean out the garbage that a luminous being picks up in the world. The owner of the restaurant where we went knew Vicente and had prepared a sumptuous breakfast for us. All of them were in great spirits, but I was unable to let go of my brooding. Then, at Don Juan's request, Juan Tuma began to talk about his journeys. He was a factual man. I became mesmerized by his dry accounts of things beyond my comprehension. To me, the most fascinating was his description of some beams of light or energy that allegedly crisscrossed the earth. He said that these beams do not fluctuate as everything else in the universe does, but are fixed into a pattern. This pattern coincides with hundreds of points in the luminous body. Hermelinda had understood that all the points were in our physical body, but Juan Tuma explained that, since the luminous body is quite big, some of the points are as much as 3 feet away from the physical body. In a sense, they are outside of us, and yet they are not. They are on the periphery of our luminosity and thus still belong to the total body. The most important of those points is located a foot away from the stomach, 40 degrees to the right of an imaginary line shooting straight forward. Juan Tuma told us that that was a center of assembling for the second attention, and that it is possible to manipulate it by gently stroking the air with the palms of the hands. Listening to Juan Tuma, I forgot my anger. My next encounter with Don Juan's world was with the West. He gave me ample warning that the first contact with the West was a most important event because it would decide, in one way or another, what I should subsequently do. He also alerted me to the fact that it was going to be a trying event, especially for me, as I was so stiff and felt so self-important. He said that the West is naturally approached at dusk, a time of day which is difficult just in itself, and that his warriors of the West were very powerful, bold, and downright maddening. At the same time, I was also going to meet the male warrior who was the man behind the scenes. Don Juan admonished me to exercise the utmost caution and patience. Not only were the women raving mad, but they and the man were the most powerful warriors he had ever known. They were, in his opinion, the ultimate authorities of the second attention. Don Juan did not elaborate any further. One day, as though on the spur of the moment, he suddenly decided that it was time to start on our trip to meet the Westerly women. We drove to a city in northern Mexico. Just at dusk, Don Juan directed me to stop in front of a big unlit house on the outskirts of town. We got out of the car and walked to the main door. Don Juan knocked several times. No one answered. I had the feeling that we had come at the wrong time. The house seemed empty. Don Juan kept on knocking until he apparently got tired. He signaled me to knock. He told me to keep on doing it without stopping because the people who lived in there were hard of hearing. I asked him if it would be better to return later or the next day. He told me to keep on banging on the door. After a seemingly endless wait, the door began to open slowly. A weird-looking woman stuck her head out and asked me if my intention was to break down the door or to anger the neighbors and their dogs. Don Juan stepped forward to say something. The woman stepped out and forcefully brushed him aside. She began to shake her finger at me, yelling that I was behaving as if I owned the world, as if there were no one else besides myself. I protested that I was merely doing what Don Juan had told me to do. The woman asked if I had been told to break the door down. Don Juan tried to intervene but was again brushed away. The woman looked as if she had just gotten out of bed. She was a mess. Our knocking had probably awakened her, and she must have put on a dress from her basket of dirty clothes. She was barefoot. Her hair was graying and terribly unkempt. She had red, beady eyes. She was a homely woman, but somehow very impressive, rather tall, about 5 feet 8, dark and enormously muscular. Her bare arms were knotted with hard muscles. I noticed that she had beautifully shaped calves. She looked me up and down, towering over me, and shouted that she had not heard my apologies. Don Juan whispered to me that I should apologize loud and clear. Once I had done that, the woman smiled and turned to Don Juan and hugged him as if he were a child. She grumbled that he should not have made me knock because my touch on the door was too shifty and disturbing. She held Don Juan's arm and led him inside, helping him over the high threshold. She called him dearest little old man. Don Juan laughed. I was appalled to see him acting as if he were delighted at the absurdities of that scary woman. Once she had helped the dearest little old man into the house, she turned to me and made a gesture with her hand to shoo me away, as if I were a dog. She laughed at my surprise. Her teeth were big, uneven, and filthy. Then she seemed to change her mind and told me to come in. Don Juan was heading to a door that I could barely see at the end of a dark hall. The woman scolded him for not knowing where he was going. She took us through another dark hall. The house seemed to be enormous, and there was not a single light in it. The woman opened a door to a very large room, almost empty except for 2 old armchairs in the center under the weakest light bulb I had ever seen. It was an old-fashioned long bulb. Another woman was sitting in one of the armchairs. The first woman sat down on a small straw mat on the floor and rested her back against the other chair. Then she put her thighs against her breasts, exposing herself completely. She was not wearing underpants. I stared at her dumbfounded. In an ugly, gruff tone, the woman asked me why I was staring at her vagina. I did not know what to say except to deny it. She stood up and seemed about to hit me. She demanded that I tell her that I had gaped at her because I had never seen a vagina in my life. I felt guilty. I was thoroughly embarrassed and also annoyed at having been caught in such a situation. The woman asked Don Juan what kind of nagual I was if I had never seen a vagina. She began repeating this over and over, yelling it at the top of her voice. She ran around the room and stopped by the chair where the other woman was sitting. She shook her by the shoulders and, pointing at me, said that I was a man who had never seen a vagina in his whole life. She laughed and taunted me. I was mortified. I felt that Don Juan should have done something to save me from that humiliation. I remembered that he had told me these women were quite mad. He had understated it. This woman was ready for an institution. I looked at Don Juan for support and advice. He looked away. He seemed to be equally at a loss, although I thought I caught a malicious smile which he quickly hid by turning his head. The woman lay down on her back and pulled up her skirt and commanded me to look to my heart's content instead of sneaking glances. My face must have been red, judging by the heat in my head and neck. I was so annoyed that I almost lost control. I felt like bashing her head in. The woman who was sitting in the chair suddenly stood up and grabbed the other one by the hair and made her stand up in one single motion, seemingly with no effort at all. She stared at me through half-closed eyes, bringing her face no more than 2 or 3 inches from mine. She smelled surprisingly fresh. In a high-pitched voice, she said that we should get down to business. Both of the women stood close to me under the light bulb. They did not look alike. The second woman was older, or looked older, and her face was covered by a thick coat of cosmetic powder that gave her a clownish appearance. Her hair was neatly arranged in a chignon. She seemed calm except for a continuous tremor in her lower lip and chin. Both women were equally tall and strong-looking. They towered menacingly over me and stared at me for a long time. Don Juan did not do anything to break their fixation. The older woman nodded her head, and Don Juan told me that her name was Zuleika and that she was a dreamer. The woman who had opened the door was named Zoila, and she was a stalker. Zuleika turned to me and, in a parrot-like voice, asked me if it was true that I had never seen a vagina. Don Juan could not hold his composure any longer and began to laugh. With a gesture, I signaled him that I did not know what to say. He whispered in my ear that it would be better for me to say that I had not, otherwise I should be prepared to describe a vagina, because that was what Zuleika would demand that I do next. I answered accordingly, and Zuleika said that she felt sorry for me. Then she ordered Zoila to show me her vagina. Zoila lay down on her back under the light bulb and opened her legs. Don Juan was laughing and coughing. I begged him to get me out of that madhouse. He whispered in my ear again that I had better take a good look and appear attentive and interested, because if I did not, we would have to stay there until Kingdom Come. After my careful and attentive examination, Zuleika said that from then on I could brag that I was a connoisseur, and that if I ever stumbled upon a woman without pants, I would not be so coarse and obscene as to let my eyes pop out of their sockets, because now I had seen a vagina. Zuleika very quietly led us to the patio. She whispered that there was someone out there waiting to meet me. The patio was pitch black. I could hardly make out the silhouettes of the others. Then I saw the dark outline of a man standing a few feet away from me. My body experienced an involuntary jolt. Don Juan spoke to the man in a very low voice, saying that he had brought me to meet him. He told the man my name. After a moment's silence, Don Juan said to me that the man's name was Silvio Manuel, and that he was the warrior of darkness and the actual leader of the whole warriors party. Then Silvio Manuel spoke to me. I thought that he must have had a speech disorder. His voice was muffled, and the words came out of him like spurts of soft coughing. He ordered me to come closer. As I tried to approach him, he receded, just as if he were floating. He led me into an even darker recess of a hall, walking, it seemed, noiselessly backwards. He muttered something I could not understand. I wanted to speak. My throat itched and was parched. He repeated something 2 or 3 times until it dawned on me that he was ordering me to undress. There was something overpowering about his voice and the darkness around him. I was incapable of disobeying. I took off my clothes and stood stark naked, shivering with fear and cold. It was so dark that I could not see if Don Juan and the 2 women were around. I heard a soft, prolonged hissing from a source a few feet away from me. Then I felt a cool breeze. I realized that Silvio Manuel was exhaling his breath all over my body. He then asked me to sit on my clothes and look at a bright point which I could easily distinguish in the darkness, a point that seemed to give out a faint amber light. I stared at it for what seemed hours, until I suddenly realized that the point of brightness was Silvio Manuel's left eye. I could then make out the contour of his whole face and his body. The hall was not as dark as it had seemed. Silvio Manuel advanced to me and helped me up. To see in the dark with such clarity enthralled me. I did not even mind that I was naked or that, as I then saw, the 2 women were watching me. Apparently they could also see in the dark. They were staring at me. I wanted to put on my pants, but Zoila snatched them out of my hands. The 2 women and Silvio Manuel stared at me for a long time. Then Don Juan came out of nowhere, handed me my shoes, and Zoila led us through a corridor to an open patio with trees. I made out the dark silhouette of a woman standing in the middle of the patio. Don Juan spoke to her and she mumbled something in reply. He told me that she was a southerly woman, that her name was Marta, and that she was a courier to the 2 westerly women. Marta said that she could bet I had never been introduced to a woman while I was naked, that the normal procedure is to get acquainted and then undress. She laughed out loud. Her laughter was so pleasing, so clear and youthful, that it sent chills through me. It reverberated through the whole house, enhanced by the darkness and the silence there. I looked to Don Juan for support. He was gone, and so was Silvio Manuel. I was alone with the 3 women. I became very nervous and asked Marta if she knew where Don Juan had gone. At that precise moment, someone grabbed the skin of my armpits. I yelled with pain. I knew that it was Silvio Manuel. He lifted me up as if I weighed nothing and shook my shoes off me. Then he stood me in a shallow tub of ice-cold water that came up to my knees. I remained in the tub for a long time while all of them scrutinized me. Then Silvio Manuel lifted me up again and set me down next to my shoes, which someone had neatly placed next to the tub. Don Juan again came out of nowhere and handed me my clothes. He whispered that I should put them on and stay only long enough to be polite. Marta gave me a towel to dry myself. I looked around for the other 2 women and Silvio Manuel, but they were nowhere in sight. Marta, Don Juan, and I stood in the darkness talking for a long time. She seemed to be speaking mainly to Don Juan, but I believed that I was her real audience. I waited for a clue from Don Juan to leave, but he appeared to be enjoying Marta's agile conversation. She told him that Zoila and Zuleika had been at the peak of their madness that day. Then she added for my benefit that they were extremely rational most of the time. As if she were revealing a secret, Marta told us that the reason Zoila's hair looked so unkempt was because at least 1/3 of it was Zuleika's hair. What had happened was that the two of them had had a moment of intense camaraderie and were helping one another to groom their hair. Zuleika braided Zoila's hair as she had done hundreds of times, except that, being out of control, she had braided portions of her own hair in with Zoila's. Marta said that when they got up from their chairs they went into a commotion. She ran to their rescue, but by the time she entered the room, Zuleika had taken over, and since she was more lucid than Zoila that day, she had decided to cut the portion of Zoila's hair that was braided to hers. She got confused in the melee that ensued and cut her own hair instead. Don Juan was laughing as if it were the funniest thing ever. I heard soft cough-like bursts of laughter coming from the darkness on the far side of the patio. Marta added that she had to improvise a chignon until Zuleika's hair grew out. I laughed along with Don Juan. I liked Marta. The two other women were abhorrent to me. They gave me a sensation of nausea. Marta, on the other hand, seemed a paragon of calm and silent purpose. I could not see her features, but I imagined her to be very beautiful. The sound of her voice was haunting. She very politely asked Don Juan if I would accept something to eat. He replied that I did not feel comfortable with Zuleika and Zoila, and that I would probably get sick to my stomach. Marta assured me that the two women were gone and took my arm and led us through the darkest hall yet into a well-lit kitchen. The contrast was too great for my eyes. I stood in the doorway trying to get used to the light. The kitchen had a very high ceiling and was fairly modern and adequate. We sat in a sort of dinette area. Marta was young and very strong. She had a plump, voluptuous figure, a round face, and a small nose and mouth. Her jet black hair was braided and coiled around her head. I thought that she must have been as curious to examine me as I had been to see her. We sat and ate and talked for hours. I was fascinated by her. She was an uneducated woman, but she held me spellbound with her talk. She gave us detailed accounts of the preposterous things that Zoila and Zuleika did when they were mad. As we drove away, Don Juan expressed his admiration for Marta. He said that she was perhaps the finest example he knew of how determination can affect a human being. With no background or preparation at all except for her unbending intent, Marta had successfully tackled the most arduous task imaginable, that of taking care of Zoila, Zuleika, and Silvio Manuel. I asked Don Juan why Silvio Manuel had refused to let me look at him in the light. He replied that Silvio Manuel was in his element in darkness, and that I was going to have countless opportunities to see him. For our first meeting, nonetheless, it was mandatory that he maintain himself within the boundaries of his power, the darkness of the night. Silvio Manuel and the two women lived together because they were a team of formidable sorcerers. Don Juan advised me that I should not make hasty judgments about the Westerly women. I had met them at a moment when they were out of control, but their lack of control pertained only to surface behavior. They had an inner core which was unalterable, thus, even at the time of their worst madness, they were capable of laughing at their own aberration, a state or condition markedly different from the norm, as if it were a performance staged by someone else. Silvio Manuel's case was different. He was in no way deranged. In fact, It was his profound sobriety that enabled him to deal so effectively with those two women, because he and they were opposite extremes. Don Juan said that Silvio Manuel had been born that way, and everyone around him acknowledged his difference. Even his benefactor, who was stern and unsparing with everybody, lavished a great deal of attention on Silvio Manuel. It took Don Juan years to understand the reason for this preference. Due to something inexplicable in his nature, once Silvio Manuel had entered into the left side awareness, he never came out of it. His proclivity to remain in a state of heightened awareness, coupled with the superb leadership of his benefactor, allowed him to arrive before anyone else, not only at the conclusion that the rule is a map, and there is in fact another kind of awareness, but also to the actual passageway into that other world of awareness. Don Juan said that Silvio Manuel, in a most impeccable manner, balanced his excessive gains by putting them at the service of their common purpose. He became the silent force behind Don Juan. My last introductory encounter with Don Juan's warriors was with the North. Don Juan took me to the city of Guadalajara to fulfill that meeting. He said that our appointment was only a short distance from the center of town and had to be at noon because the North was the midday. We left the hotel around 11 a.m. and took an easy stroll through the downtown area. I was walking along without watching where I was going, worried about the meeting, and I collided head-on with a lady who was rushing out of a store. She was carrying packages, which scattered all over the ground. I apologized and began to help her pick them up. Don Juan urged me to hurry because we were going to be late. The lady seemed to be stunned. I held her arm. She was a very slender, tall woman, perhaps in her 60s, very elegantly dressed. She seemed to be a lady of social standing. She was exquisitely polite and assumed the blame, saying that she had been distracted looking for her manservant. She asked me if I would help her locate him in the crowd. I turned to Don Juan. He said that the least I could do after nearly killing her was to help her. I took her packages and we walked back into the store. A short distance away I spotted a forlorn-looking Indian who seemed thoroughly out of place there. The lady called him and he came to her side like a lost puppy. He looked as if he was about to lick her hand. Don Juan was waiting for us outside the store. He explained to the lady that we were in a hurry and then told her my name. The lady smiled graciously and initiated a handshake. I thought that in her youth she must have been ravishing, because she was still beautiful and alluring. Don Juan turned to me and abruptly said that her name was Nolita, that she was of the North, and that she was a dreamer. Then he made me face the manservant and said that his name was Genaro Flores, and that he was the man of action, the warrior of deeds in the party. My surprise was total. All three of them had a belly laugh. The greater my dismay, the more they seemed to enjoy it. Don Genaro gave the packages away to a group of children, telling them that his employer, the kind lady who was talking, had bought those things as a present for them. It was her good deed for the day. Then we strolled in silence for half a block. I was tongue-tied. Suddenly Nolita pointed to a store and asked us to wait just an instant, because she had to pick up a box of nylons that they were holding for her there. She peered at me, smiling, her eyes shining, and told me that, all kidding aside, sorcery or no sorcery, she had to wear nylons and lace panties. Don Juan and Don Genaro laughed like two idiots. I stared at Nolita because I could not do anything else. There was something about her that was utterly earthly, and yet she was almost ethereal. She kiddingly told Don Juan to hold on to me because I was about to pass out. Then she politely asked Don Gennaro to run in and get her order from a specific clerk. As he started in, Nolita seemed to change her mind and called him back, but he apparently did not hear her and disappeared inside the store. She excused herself and ran after him. Don Juan pressed my back to get me out of my turmoil. He said that I would meet the other northerly woman, whose name was Florinda, by herself at another time, because she was to be my link into another cycle, another mood. He described Florinda as a carbon copy of Nolita, or vice versa. I remarked that Nolita was so sophisticated and stylish that I could imagine seeing her in a fashion magazine. The fact that she was beautiful and so fair, perhaps of French or Northern Italian extraction, had surprised me. Although Vicente was not an Indian either, his rural appearance made him less of an anomaly. I asked Don Juan why there were non-Indians in his world. He said that power is what selects the warriors of Inagual's party, and that it is impossible to know its designs. We waited in front of the store for perhaps half an hour. Don Juan seemed to get impatient and asked me to go inside and tell them to hurry. I walked into the store. It was not a big place, there was no back door, and yet they were nowhere in sight. I asked the clerks, but they could not help me. I confronted Don Juan and demanded to know what had happened. He said that they had either disappeared into thin air or had sneaked out while he was cracking my back. I raged at him that most of his people were tricksters. He laughed until tears were rolling down his cheeks. He said that I was the ideal dupe. My self-importance made me a most enjoyable subject. He was laughing so hard at my annoyance that he had to lean against a wall. Lagorda gave me an account of her first meeting with the members of Don Juan's party. Her version differed only in content. The form was the same. The warriors were perhaps a bit more violent with her, but she had understood this as their attempt to shake her out of her slumber, and also as a natural reaction to what she considered her ugly personality. As we reviewed Don Juan's world, we realized that it was a replica of his benefactor's world. It could be seen as consisting either of groups or households. There was a group of 4 independent pairs of apparent sisters who worked and lived together, another group of 3 men who were Don Juan's age and were very close to him, a team of 2 somewhat younger men, the couriers Emilito and Juan Tuma, and finally a team of 2 younger, southerly women who seemed to be related to each other, Marta and Teresa. At other times it could be seen as consisting of 4 separate households, located quite far from one another in different areas of Mexico. One was made up of the 2 westerly women, Zuleika and Zoila, Silvio Manuel, and the courier Marta. The next was composed of the southerly women, Cecilia and Delia, Don Juan's courier, Emilito, and the courier Teresa. Another household was formed by the easterly women, Carmela and Hermelinda, Vicente, and the courier Juan Tuma, and the last, of the northerly women, Nolita and Florinda, and Don Gennaro. According to Don Juan, his world did not have the harmony and balance of his benefactors. The only 2 women who thoroughly balanced one another and who looked like identical twins were the northerly warriors, Nolita and Florinda. Nolita once told me in casual conversation, they were so alike that they even had the same blood type. For me, one of the most pleasant surprises of our interaction was the transformation of Zuleika and Zoila, who had been so abhorrent. They turned out to be, as Don Juan had said, the most sober and dutiful warriors imaginable. I could not believe my eyes when I saw them again. Their mad spell had passed and they now looked like two well-dressed Mexican ladies, tall, dark, and muscular, with brilliant dark eyes like pieces of shiny black obsidian. They laughed and joked with me about what had happened the night of our first meeting, as if someone else and not they had been involved in it. I could easily understand Don Juan's turmoil with the westerly warriors of his benefactor's party. It was impossible for me to accept that Zuleika and Zoila could ever turn into such obnoxious, nauseating creatures as I had first encountered. I was to witness their metamorphoses many times, yet I was never again able to judge them as harshly as I had on our first encounter. More than anything else, their outrages made me feel sad. But the biggest surprise to me was Silvio Manuel. In the darkness of our first meeting, I had imagined him to be an imposing man, an overpowering giant. In fact, he was tiny, but not small-bone tiny. His body was like the body of a jockey, small, yet perfectly proportioned. He looked to me as if he might be a gymnast. His physical control was so remarkable that he could puff himself up like a toad to nearly twice his size by contracting all the muscles of his body. He used to give astounding demonstrations of how he could dislodge his joints and put them back together again without any overt signs of pain. Looking at Silvio Manuel, I always experienced a deep unfamiliar feeling of fright. To me, he seemed like a visitor from another time. He was pale dark, like a bronze statue. His features were sharp, his aquiline nose, full lips, and widely separated, slanted eyes made him look like a stylized figure on a Mayan fresco. He was friendly and warm during the daytime, but as soon as the twilight set in, he would become unfathomable. His voice would change. He would sit in a dark corner and let the darkness swallow him. All that was visible of him was his left eye, which remained open and acquired a strange shine, reminiscent of the eyes of a feline. A secondary issue that came up in the course of our interaction with Don Juan's warriors was the subject of controlled folly. Don Juan gave me a succinct explanation once when he was discussing the two categories into which all the women warriors are mandatorily divided, the dreamers and the stalkers. He said that all the members of his party did dreaming and stalking as part of their daily lives, but that the women who made up the planet of the dreamers and the planet of the stalkers were the foremost authorities on their respective activities. The stalkers are the ones who take the brunt of the daily world. They are the business managers, the ones who deal with people. Everything that has to do with the world of ordinary affairs goes through them. The stalkers are the practitioners of controlled folly, just as the dreamers are the practitioners of dreaming. In other words, controlled folly is the basis for stalking, as dreams are the basis for dreaming. Don Juan said that, generally speaking, a warrior's greatest accomplishment in the second attention is dreaming, and in the first attention his greatest accomplishment is stalking. I had misunderstood what Don Juan's warriors were doing to me in our first meetings. I took their actions as instances of trickery, and that would still be my impression today, had it not been for the idea of controlled folly. Don Juan said that their actions with me had been masterful lessons in stalking. He told me that the art of stalking was what his benefactor had taught him before anything else. In order to survive among his benefactor's warriors, he had had to learn that art quickly. In my case, he said, since I did not have to contend by myself with his warriors, I had to learn dreaming first. When the time was right, Florinda would step out to guide me into the complexities of stalking. No one else could deliberately talk to me about it. They could only give me direct demonstrations, as they had already done in our first meetings. Don Juan explained to me at great length that Florinda was one of the foremost practitioners of stalking, because she had been trained in every intricacy of it by his benefactor and his 4 female warriors who were stalkers. Florinda was the first female warrior to come into Don Juan's world, and because of that, she was to be my personal guide not only in the art of stalking, but also in the mystery of the third attention, if I ever got there. Don Juan did not elaborate on this. He said it would have to wait until I was ready, first to learn stalking, and then to enter into the third attention. Don Juan said that his benefactor had taken extra time and care with him and his warriors in everything that pertained to their mastering the art of stalking. He used complex ploys to create an appropriate context for a counterpoint between the dictums of the rule and the behavior of the warriors in the daily world as they interacted with people. He believed that that was the way to convince them that, in the absence of self-importance, a warrior's only way of dealing with the social milieu is in terms of controlled folly. In the course of working out his ploys, Don Juan's benefactor would pit the actions of people and the actions of the warriors against the commands of the rule, and would then sit back and let the natural drama unfold itself. The folly of the people would take the lead for a while and drag the warriors into it, as seems to be the natural course, only to be vanquished in the end by the more encompassing designs of the rule. Don Juan told us that at first he resented his benefactor's control over the players. He even told him that to his face. His benefactor was not fazed. He argued that his control was merely an illusion created by the eagle. He was only an impeccable warrior, and his actions were a humble attempt to mirror the eagle. Don Juan said that the force with which his benefactor carried out his designs originated from his knowledge that the eagle is real and final, and that what people do is utter folly. The two together gave rise to controlled folly, which Don Juan's benefactor described as the only bridge between the folly of people and the finality of the eagle's dictums. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.